Rebecca Lamar, and I am applying to be the part-time parent resource trainer for Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And this specific video is to showcase my training style in a live face-to-face training while I'm discussing the topic of separation and loss, as well as the grieving process. So the first thing that I do want to share with all of you in this class is that sometimes when we talk about separation and loss, sometimes we can also go through our own feelings. There may be things that we talk about that may trigger you and have you feel uncomfortable to stay in the training. And I encourage you to raise your hand or get my attention so that we can connect and plan how to get you over the hump of this as we continue on our training. Understanding separation and loss, as well as the grieving process, is really, really important when we're looking for how we can best support children that may be in our care, as well as being a part of the support system for our adult family members, our colleagues, as well as some of the individuals in this classroom. So as we go through these slides, I do encourage you to also think about a time where you may have experienced separation or loss. That may help you to better understand and connect with our content this afternoon. Again, I'll share with you, if you do need to take a moment to recenter yourself, you can have the option of closing your eyes for just a minute, or again, as I stated before, raising your hand, getting my attention, and we can work through that process together. So as you see on the screen, we're really going to be focusing specifically on the grieving process. And when we look at this slide, we see 5 different elements of the grieving process: shock and denial, anger, depression, bargaining, and finally, resolution and acceptance. One thing that I want to share with all of you is that the grieving process is a natural response. It's something that's supposed to happen. I know it's not always the most comfortable, and I certainly understand that it can seem like it is something that you're going through over and over and over again. And this afternoon, we are absolutely going to talk about those components of the grieving process. I think the other thing to remember is as you go through your own grieving process, as you see others go through their grieving process, no one person's process is going to look like anyone else's process. And so that's something that we'll talk a little bit later on in our session when we talk about how we can best support children in our care. So the first stage of grief is denial and shock. And one of the things that we want to talk about this afternoon is to really focus on what can be emotions and feelings associated with that part of the process. So first, scientists and researchers share that denial is really the part of the stage that helps us survive our loss. It has an element of shock where sometimes we can feel stunned, or we may not be able to even recognize that this is something that could have happened to us in general. Earlier, I asked you to come up with some ideas and examples of when you have experienced loss or separation. And I'm going to take a moment to just hear you share some of those examples just in a few words. So I will take those right now. As we continue to connect back to the process and speaking about shock and denial, there are things that I definitely want to bring to the center of our conversation. First and foremost, when we're going through the first stage, it can feel like we are in some sort of altered reality. It can feel like this has to be happening to another person, and you might sometimes feel like you're watching yourself go through this first part of the grieving process. I think one of the things that I remember in my own experience connecting to when I've gone through the grieving process was really when I lost my father at a pretty young age. I was about 12 years old. And I remember thinking and feeling the shock of knowing that the next morning I wouldn't have the opportunity to wake up and get a hug and kiss from him. And I certainly remember trying to help myself process, and as a 12-year-old child, pretending that my father was on a very, very long business trip. As a 12-year-old child, that was one of the only ways that I could personally begin my process of grieving the loss of my father. The next stage in the grieving process is anger. And as we talk about what this could look like, there are different components or feelings associated with that process. We can have directed anger toward one person or one organization or one entity or even to God. And we certainly can be in a place where we begin to blame others as well as ourselves for our own separation and loss. I certainly remember feeling lots of anger as I went through my process grieving the loss of my father. I remember being angry at God and asking him why he would do this and how could this happen to me. And that was absolutely a part of my grieving process. Anger is part of a process that has to be gone through. The next stage in the grieving process is depression. And I think when we talk about depression, that oftentimes is the stage that is the most accepted of all of the stages of grief. It makes sense to us to see others upset, in despair, really withdrawing from some of their traditional activities to make sure that they are going through their own process of depression. Some of the feelings associated with depression can really feel like a numbness or a disconnect to the rest of the world around us. It can also feel like an emptiness or despair. There's this sense of uncertainty. We're not sure how we may be able to get out of this space, and we're not sure how long we will be in this space. It can make us feel stuck, and it can make us sometimes feel suicidal thoughts as well. That is part of the process of depression. So the next stage of the grieving process is bargaining. And when we think about bargaining in this process, I want you to consider what it may have felt like as you went through your own separation and loss, when you began to think about, okay, this separation or loss is permanent, but maybe I could do something to either change the course of my future or change what initially happens. And so sometimes when we get into the bargaining stage of grief, sometimes we make some promises that may seem very, very out of the ordinary or may not be possible. I certainly remember when I was going through my divorce several years ago, I remember coming and trying to bargain with God to figure out if there was anything that I could do to help some of my pain and despair go away. So as we talked about the last part of grieving process, or the last stage prior to bargaining is depression, those two seem to have the same space together often. And I remember in some of my bargaining pleas with God, I promised that I would be a better volunteer in the church. I promised that I would be a greater and better mother, if only I could get through this hump. The last part of the grieving process is resolution and acceptance. This is a key part of the process because it's our acknowledgement to ourselves and often to others that we're ready to begin to move on from our separation and loss. Sometimes resolution and acceptance can mean planning to seek help to go through and finalize your stages of grief. And other times it can really give you pause to really think about, again, using my example of my father, It's not that it's okay that I lost him, but I can acknowledge that I did lose him and I will be okay. So just to review the stages that we talked about, we talked a little bit about shock and denial, we talked about anger, we talked about depression and bargaining, and we talked about the final stages of resolution and acceptance. It's important for us to remember that there's no specific amount of time that each person should spend in each part of the stage. And you can certainly go through this process a few times as you're working through your own loss and separation. And finally, it's really important to recognize that everyone has and goes through their own stages in their own time. So at this point, I'm going to ask us to do a little bit of an activity in our training, just to review what we discussed and give you an opportunity to move around and talk with a peer. So what I'm going to ask you to do is, on a scrap piece of paper, draw a roller coaster. Don't worry, you don't have to be a Van Gogh or a Frida Kahlo. You can just free draw a track of a roller coaster, maybe similar to the one that's on the picture on the screen. I'm going to ask you to recall the 5 stages that we talked about: shock and denial, anger, depression, bargaining, resolution, and acceptance. And I'd like for you to label those words in the loops of your actual roller coaster. I want you to think about the grieving process as a roller coaster. You're gonna go through circles, you're gonna go upside down sometimes, you're gonna go fast, but it's all part of the process. And similar to what we think about with roller coasters, there are ups and downs. There are serious and heavy emotions associated with it. And finally, there is a stop and start to the roller coaster ride, similar to your process of grieving. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share with you my training style. I hope to hear from you soon.